European elections, 60% of Freedom Party voters said, yes, this was a wrong decision, we shouldn't have done that. By the way, in '94, when we had the referendum on joining the European Union, we had a 66% ratio voting for it. And if you compare that to the other parties, to the Social Democrats, for example, with 24% saying that, the People's Party 14%, the NEOs, the Liberal Party in Austria, 5%, and the Greens only 7%, you can see that this is really a differentiating issue when it comes to the Austrian electorate. And I think this is also reflected in the United States and some other countries we already discussed. The question, or exactly the attitude, I don't have little or no influence, or confidence actually, corresponds also to influence, in political parties or politicians. You see that 89% of Freedom Party voters think that this is just, non-confidence relationship. So just to point out what I understand under fields of difference and polarization in the Austrian political landscape. Now, let's turn to the Freedom Party, as many of you might be most interested, of course, in this party. It's just a historic fact, just to show you how they did in the last 30 years or so, or 25 years. And actually, you saw a double rise, and the first started here in the year 1986, when a guy called Jörg Haider, whom you probably remember, took over the party from a not entirely liberal party, but from a less populist party that was in government actually in 1983 to 86, and took it really to its peak at around 27% of the vote in 1999, coming in second, just shy of catching also the Social Democrats that were in the first place back then. Then, you might ask, why was there this sharp drop? This was because the Freedom Party went into government, was part of government, and of course they couldn't keep up to their populist and opposition DNA in government. This might be also a phenomenon they might be facing this time around too. In 2005, Mr. Strache, that's here, took over, the party boss now, Vice Chancellor of the Republic since a couple of months. And here you can see the rise again. They're back up to 26% again. So to the message of the Freedom Party. And again, this might sound familiar because you see, the same thing with Mr. Trump, with the AfD that was mentioned today, with UKIP, with other populist movements around the world. Again, I want to stress, we've seen that in Austria since the year 1986, with basically the same message, and without so-called refugee crisis of the year 2015. You have the message since Mr. Haider, and make no mistake about it, Mr. Haider was a far more talented politician as opposed to Mr. Strache, who is building on the fundament, the base that Mr. Haider was laying out. You have the Austria First message, you have an anti-immigrant message, you have an anti-establishment message against the formerly grand coalition of Social Democrats and People's Party. You have an anti-media message, very much so, also back then established by Mr. Haider. You do have an anti-stalemate message, an anti-compromise message, which I think is very important, especially when it comes to polarization. Telling you should have clear decisions, you shouldn't care about, having a compromise, about social partnership whatsoever. This is a really core thing, I think, for the Freedom Party. And of course, as we've heard a couple of times yesterday and today already, creating scapegoats. But make no mistake about it, I think this is a very important thing, as we've heard a couple of very interesting takes. I think the very interesting thing about the Freedom Party is that it was refining its message over time. And again, starting 86, now we have 2018, it's a very different tone, as you see. It's always the same message, don't get me wrong, but the tone is very different. I'm just showing you a couple of messages they got out there. 1999, Austria First. Yeah, Österreich zuerst. So Mr. Trump was invented in Austria, actually. Versus foreign infiltration, which means Überfremdung. hard word to translate. But this was done in 1999. This was the first battle of Mr. Strache as party head of the Freedom Party in Vienna against the city mayor. Till today, till May, he'll shift over in a couple of weeks. The Battle of Vienna, and of course you can notice this is the mayor, this is Mr. Strache. Here is the mosque, one of the mosques of Vienna. Here is St. Stephen's, of course, you know, for the Christian heritage, whatever. And the line here reads, you've got the choice, you know. Those guys for immigrants, the other one is for us, Austrians. So a very classical message that might not surprise you. This was done in 2006 versus the European Union, petition actually against the European Union. Interesting take, you know, with, of course, the anti-Muslim message, which is one of the core messages of the Freedom Party also right now, because they also refined it there. They're trying to narrow it down and say maybe not all immigrants are a problem, but you know, especially those coming from Muslim countries. This one is a little hard to grab for non-German speakers, but the point is it's rhyming in German, Daheim statt Islam, which means at home instead of Islam. Doesn't make real sense in English, but as you see, it's rhyming in English. Of course, always with the Austrian flag. And this is about, you know, where you'd say, okay, that's not so surprising. But since then, actually, they changed a lot. At least, as I said, not in their message, but in their tone, delivering their message. This was done in 2013, and here you see the first shift. They're not saying, okay, immigrants leave the country, but they say we should be there for our people, for our country, our money to our people, which is, as I said, the same message, but you know, formulated in a more indirect way, probably. And it says basically, you know, charity begins at home. I put it in brackets, and ends also at home. This was Mr. Hofer at the presidential level. So help me God, of course, a reference to the Christian heritage of Austria, also an indirect way of playing with certain stereotypes, of course. And you have, and this was the peak of it so far, they fell back a little to their old message. Maybe Yussi is going to talk about that in a minute, since they are in government again, since last December. But this was done in the general election leading up to October 2017, and it's a totally different tone. Again, look at what they're doing, the use of humor in a sense, the not so aggressive tone of this video. And it really also went viral, you know, those clips were rather successful among the potential Freedom Party voters. So let's have a look at it. I hope the translation is working with subtitles. Sometimes a little too much text, but this is very German, actually. So let's listen.
Neulich bei den Hubers.
Hasi, da ist ein Haus. Ich hab dir gesagt, du sollst zusperren. Jetzt rum was. Hasi? Wieso? Sind da überall Leute?
Was weiß ich? Keine Ahnung. Palatschinken. Lecker. Yummy. Wer will noch Marmelade haben? Landesliebe. Ich glaube, wir müssen einkaufen gehen. Und ich habe schon eine Einkaufsliste.
Und du glaubst wirklich, dass wir uns das alles zusätzlich leisten können?
Es tut mir leid, dass ich gestern nicht abgesperrt habe. Ich habe die Tür verschlossen, die ist jetzt zu, okay? Ich muss nur noch die Fenster zumachen. Aber ich verspreche dir, ich werde alles unter Kontrolle. Noch bei Palatschinken?
Wie lange wird es noch brauchen, bis Rot-Schwarz begreift, was die Österreicher längst wissen? Solange dieses unfaire Sozialsystem existiert, werden weiterhin Wirtschaftsflüchtlinge zu uns strömen. Egal wie viele Runden sie angeblich noch schließen möchten.
Wir sind pleite.
So this is exactly what I was talking about. It's a new tone, it's a different tone, it's less aggressive, it's still the same message. You know, we don't need those refugees, we don't need those immigrants. because they're far too expensive, we can't afford it, we don't want them. But it's a different kind of framing there, right? Why did they do that? Also, of course, because, and I will get to that in a second, also because they were threatened by one of the governing parties, the People's Party, that really took over the Freedom Party message in a totally different way, in a more socially acceptable way, and that's why the Freedom Party also refined their message. And this is, I don't know if we will see that in other circumstances, in other landscapes, but you can certainly see it in Austria with, as I said, history of more than 30 years of right-wing populism. Did it do anything to the Austrian landscape? Of course it did, because the framing of the refugee crisis was one, maybe the most important signal issue in this general election, really determining the outcome. And if you remember, George Lakoff's theory of framing, we saw a couple of pictures back in 2015. Sorry, that's right after your lunch, but I don't want to skip that. This was the idea of probably the nurturing parent frame. The Syrian boy dying on the beach of Turkey that went around the world. You had a couple of days before that, 71 casualties, refugees dying on this truck, probably already in Hungary, but they stopped it in Austria near Vienna. This, of course, evoked in many Austrians this nurturing parent frame. However, and this was a major shift and a major thing, this was, followed by a couple and more pictures that really were playing to the strict father frame, in terms of we can't let that happen. It's not going to work. This is refugees basically running over a couple of policemen and soldiers that you see in the picture at the southern border of Austria. Right after that, of course, we had the problem of, talking about building a wall. I have to speed up a little bit, I'll skip that. Just three things. How did Austrian politics react so far to the Freedom Party? Three attitudes, three ways of doing this. First, the old government really not doing anything, trying to ignore the Freedom Party frames. There was a meeting of back then Chancellor and Vice Chancellor, what they're working on. That was one of the problems. A picture, by the way, they produced themselves. So that didn't work. Mr. Kurz, the current Chancellor of our country, tried to copy, of course, the Freedom Party agenda, and really was getting to the swing votes in Austria. And there is a swing vote in Austria. This is a major difference to what Mark Mellon told you about the US yesterday. Of course, as it is a multi-party system, you can do that. Where it will lead, we don't know. What we also saw, and this is just 15 seconds before we get to the last slide. The third, kind of reaction was polarized too. And I think it's really playing into the same field as the Freedom Party is trying to do. Look at that, and this says something to the Freedom Party voters. Don't make no mistake about it, They feel that they are looked down at, and this is, I think, the problem. So this was done by an outside group in favor of Mr. van der Beyden and attacking Mr. Hofer.
Ein Gespenst geht in Europa. Das Gespenst des Nationalismus. Es bedroht, was nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg geschaffen wurde. Unser geeintes, friedliches Europa. Die Nationalisten aller Länder haben dieses Europa ins Visier genommen. Extreme Populisten wie Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, Heinz-Christian Strache und Norbert Hofer.
And it goes on like that. So if you really compare it to the Second World War, I think it's quite a stretch. And also this side should be a little bit careful about how to add to polarization, because the message you get as a Freedom Party voter is, of course, a very clear one. Last slide. What hasn't been tested yet, maybe might also work in other circumstances, other environments, developing your own vision for a country. First take, second take. Try to reframe the debate, especially with, of course, immigrant and related issues. Also not really been done other than softening the tone. And triangulation, trying to really find a position above the existing two positions. Thank you so much.
I'm going to talk about briefly the Trump playbook, or how to become a successful populist in 7 easy steps. Just so we're clear where I stand, I worked in the fall of 2016 on the other side of Trump, and I'm trying to marry sort of what I've witnessed in the US. But as Thomas said, I'm from Austria, but also from Austria, how the populists, how the extremists utilize certain tactics, and how we can just in order to, that we know how they use it in order to combat. And the first one definitely is produce your news. I'm not even talking about fake news necessarily. I'm just talking about the fact that the trust in media, as we heard yesterday and today, is declining, that people more and more can read wherever they get their sources from. So we as organizations, and populists do that already. FPÖ has a TV channel, a YouTube channel that is now on Facebook with a couple of thousand views a week. They are producing their news. Donald Trump decided very early on to produce news, like a talk show, like we know it from American TV, right? There's a bunch of, oh, my presentation isn't there. That would help. Okay. Oh, there you go. Okay. Donald Trump, produced a TV show in the sort of media literacy as we know on cable TV. There's a couple of pundits talking in front of a backdrop, in front of a busy backdrop. It's something everyone can do with their phones at this point. But the genius thing of this photo is not, that I took a screenshot of the Facebook page as it happened. The photo is actually, as you see in the corner, a photo of MSNBC live streaming said news event by Donald Trump, giving it even more reach. This is something Sebastian Kurz copied, like many other things. He had, for the last week or so, last 10 days of the campaign, a nightly news show on Facebook Live, doing exactly that, pushing its own news. The second rule of how to become a good populist is not just scapegoating. Obviously, we know that we've witnessed that for the last couple of years, centuries, but also argue against strawmen. And Sebastian Kurz, the chancellor, just had a great example of that just last week. He tweeted, there was a knife attack in Vienna, 4 people got wounded, no one died. I wish the victims of the knife attack in Vienna yesterday a speedy recovery. Such incidents are unbearable and cannot be tolerated. The citizens need to feel safe. The full force of law has to be applied against the arrested criminal from Afghanistan. It's clear that in the past mistakes have been made in immigration and asylum policy. Unlimited migration is the ground for many problems with which we're confronted currently. The new government wants to alleviate mistakes of the past. The translation is by me, it was a German tweet. And the highlights are from me as well, because I wanted to get your focus on a couple of these points. Such incidents are unbearable and cannot be tolerated implies that someone is tolerating such incidents, which obviously is not the case. That's the first strawman. Citizens need to feel safe. Safe that's going to be on the next slide when we talk about felt security versus actual security. The full force of law has to be applied against the criminal. Twitter has now 280 characters. He still had to shorten a couple of words in order to get in that the perpetrator was from Afghanistan. And the last point is extremely, it summarizes Kurz's message very well. And it's astonishing how he gets through, but he does. It's clear that in the past mistakes have been made. Sebastian Kurz, for everyone who doesn't know, has had the integration agendas for the last 7 years. So if anyone has made the mistake of migration and asylum policy, then it would have been him, or you could argue the Secretary for Interior, who was a party colleague, is a party colleague of his also for the last several years. So this is how Kurz argues and how Kurz frames the debate. On the other side, we have Donald Trump emphasizing from Afghanistan in his own way. He, as you might know, started Voice, a organization within the, was it me? Oh, okay. An organization within the Customs and Immigration Patrol, ICE. It's the Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement. So it's to emphasize those crimes that have been perpetrated by people who are them, not us. Appeal to truthiness. Stephen Colbert coined this term a long time ago. In 2004, in his first appearance as the conservative pundit Stephen Colbert, he talked about truthiness back then in regards with George Bush. But truthiness is in the core of Sebastian Kurz's and Donald Trump's rhetoric. It's not about facts. It's not about what the actual numbers tell us about security and safety. It's about how people feel. And obviously, if you emphasize crimes, and it's not just the politicians, but also the yellow press that emphasizes certain crimes versus other crimes, and then so by then causing felt insecurity, and then appeal in order for policies in order to alleviate not the security that is actually factual, but the security that is actually felt. So if you want to become a good populist, think about how to appeal, how to create a certain sentiment, and how to appeal to it. Moving red lines, something the Freedom Party has done for 30 years now. The first plebiscite, the first referendum against foreigners was in 1992. The things that they asked for then are now mainstream in the Austrian discourse. Why is that? That's because of the overtime window, a communications theory that is incredibly important to understand polarization and to understand our times. Think about the gun debate in the US. Donald Trump calls for arming teachers. No one is calling for abandoning all weapons or disallowing all weapons, which means that the window of things that are thinkable shifts in slow increments. Right? There's the policy in the middle, and then there's unthinkable ideas, radical ideas, and only one side for the last 30 years has always emphasized radical, unthinkable ideas, and slowly but surely moved this window of things and policies to think of. Frame first, Thomas mentioned it already. We not only see frames of the paternal father, but we also see frames of dehumanization. It's about refugee streams. It's a tsunami of refugees. It's all words where those people that are migrating, that people are fleeing, are not seen as people anymore. In our language, and the right wing in Austria, as well as in the US, is very good at framing the debate first and having the right terms first and emphasizing the right terms. In Trump, for example, to go back to the immigration issue, chain migration is not a term that exists in real life. Chain migration means if someone immigrates to a country, they can bring their family after a certain period of time. Trump coined the phrase chain migration for it as if it would be an automatic thing where one person comes, which means a whole swath of 300 other relatives could come in, and its chain is something ongoing and unlimited and endless. But just the frame alone wasn't the problem. The frame was also copied by the Democrats to say, no, we still want chain migration or something like that. So they used the same words, and so they're falling in the framing trap. Two more things. Make yourself the victim. The Freedom Party is, a player in that that's astonishing, but also Sebastian Kurz. His mantra in the last election is, we are not going to participate in mutual mudslinging. That's what his line was for every accusation. It was, regardless if it was a policy accusation or an actual dirty campaign sort of messaging, the answer was always, we're not participating in the mutual mudslinging, which again builds up a straw man and implies the other people are mudslinging, but it also positions himself in the victim. The whole fake news debate is, especially when Trump talks about mainstream media and fake news, he is the victim of that media and of the evil empire and the evil elite. And lastly, threaten lawsuits, but, and that's important, never follow through. We've seen that with Sebastian Kurz. Christina mentioned the Facebook pages yesterday about the truth about Sebastian Kurz and those sort of astroturfing, fake newsy, dirty campaign tactics that the SPÖ used against Sebastian Kurz. Sebastian Kurz threatened to sue them for it, and after the election pulled that lawsuit. And Donald Trump is doing that all the time, even before he ran for president. He was threatening to sue people who talked ill about his Trump University, etc., etc. Because you get the headlines anyways, but you'll never get the headline about how the lawsuit didn't happen. So those were just a brief overview of 7 steps how to become a better populist.